For that particular poem, I think what happened is that I was, in fact, washing some wine glasses. And you know how when you do something and you get this visceral feeling in your body? It really felt like putting my finger in a belly button. And that's where the poem started. And then I was thinking about my Southern Baptist grandmother who had certain ideas about the body and about sin. And things just happened from there. That's all I can tell you, honestly. Like, that poem just sort of showed up.
I love it. Yeah.
There's an orchard on a piece of land that I really love, and it doesn't make pears every year, but sometimes it does, and it's just by chance that I end up there and the pears have actually done something. And so really it's from the experience of eating those pears, which are really hard. They're hard green pears, but they're so fun to eat. And that the orchard is pretty close to the ocean, so I was just imagining what it would do for a tree to be near so much salt water. So obviously it's not strictly scientifically accurate, that poem, but that's where that came from. So I waited a really long time. I've worked as an editor for a long time, and I have done that more than I've worked on poems from time to time. So eventually I just had a body of work that felt like it ought to be a book, and I played with it a lot. I don't entirely understand the way it ended up how it did, and I had help from a lot of people, so that's part of it. Over the years that I was working on it, many different people read the manuscript and read individual poems and gave me their thoughts. And I'll say one other thing I did that was really helpful is I printed out the poems on half letter sheets, and then I took strings and strung them up in my office, or if I was at a residency, on the wall, and then I would take binder clips and clip them to the strings, and then there would be like 5 strings so I could move the poems around on their individual lines. And just doing that spatially and having something happening in the real physical world was super helpful. Like, I can't do everything on a screen. It makes me miserable, for one, and two, that you just can't think as clearly about language if it's not in your hands, I think. The friction is time. Having enough time to do it all is always hard. But I love editing poetry so much. Don't tell my prose writers I work with, but it's my favorite. And the reason is that I get to think about every single thing, like every comma, every semicolon. I get to think about whether a poet would want to even contemplate having a semicolon in their poem. Or, if there's a really long, elaborate syntactical thing that's happening over multiple lines, how is the syntax playing with the line? I get to ask myself those questions and think about how the reader will perceive them. And then I get to ask questions of the poet about how the reader might perceive it and whether that's what they intend. And just that deep contemplation of the language is so fun. It's totally different from working on my own stuff in that I'm trying to sort of empathetically get inside the mind of another writer, as opposed to trying to figure out what the hell I myself was talking about. It feels very different. And it's also different because there's a conversation that happens. My students a lot of the time will ask me, like, what is the difference between editing and workshop? And one answer to that question is that editing is a really intimate relationship. It's a one-on-one thing that allows you to have a real conversation with someone. And that, of course, the power balance is different than in workshop. You're both working toward the same goal, and you each have a really big stake in the interaction. So that makes it challenging, and it also makes it potentially really productive for the work. I would say a couple things. One thing is to be patient with the work. Like, I think that it can feel like there's a lot of pressure to put work out into the world because, jobs and everything. But sometimes a poem wants to wait. It isn't ready. And I don't want any of my students to feel like they have to be putting stuff out there that's not ready. I want them to feel like it's had the full benefit of all the time that it needs to be ready to go into the world. So I would say that, and I would also say that it's really smart to read other magazines and see what is happening in the world. currently, as opposed to reading back issues from 10 years ago. Like, what are people doing? And then to ask yourself, like, what do I like? What feels really good? And so you'll read one magazine and be like, I could skip over a lot of stuff here, and then read another one, like this one, and say, there's so much work in here that really speaks to me, and I think the people making this magazine have taken a lot of care with the work. And so, I don't know, I think that's really helpful in terms of imagining where your stuff might end up. Just being able to picture it there before you send it out into the world can be a big help. Pears. Where cloven tracks dent the deep black sandy soil, turned faintly pink in early evening light, I duck beneath the low brows of the trees and turn the windfalls over in my hands. Pale, articulate wounds break the rough brown coats. Even the whole ones are sticky, as if from spit. On the air, the scent of just fermenting fruit and just gone deer. Just east, across the lake, a mile past swamp and dunes, the ocean rolls. Last year, a hurricane flooded the orchard. Months on, blue crabs walked the less and less brackish lake bed as the water lilies returned, and the waterweed. The crabs could not last. The orchard grass is back, in soil washed through with salt. A fat green pear has fallen to the crook of one tree's branches. I lift it out and balance it on the others, whole and near whole, cradled in my shirt. Cutting them open in the evening kitchen, we meet the center deer and humans crave, the sweetest water I know, squeezed from between hard stony cells that greet the tongue like grains of salt, that tempering texture, the very thing you'd think would come from flowers in May, across the lake and swamp, over dunes, through myrtle and pine, conversing with the ocean, nectar and stone, the fresh and salt, in each fine pear made one.